So if you were able to be with us last week, you know that we just started a brand new series in the book of Daniel. And if you weren't here last week, that's okay, because we just started. So you're right on time, honestly. But we are in the book of Daniel, and the kind of the subtitle that we have for the book of Daniel is Certain Hope for Uncertain Times. That is why we are choosing the book of Daniel right now, because as I kind of sample my own spirit in our age, I feel like we live in very uncertain times. And so I've gravitated to Daniel because I need to ground myself in the certain hope that Daniel has and that is available to all of us as we are followers of Jesus. But we are in a time that is very uncertain, right? Do you feel the uncertainty? Do you feel the changes, the waves, the sense that we are just kind of in ever more critical moments, and the sense that things are probably not going in the direction that we hope that they will go? And so it is a time that I believe all of us need to spend in Daniel, that we would anchor ourselves in certain hope for uncertain times. So last week, we began the book of Daniel to see why we need this certain hope for uncertain times, because Daniel reveals to us and helps us grapple with those three realities of our world. The first being that we are subjected to the powers of the world. The second, that our status in this world is exiles. But then third, that we always have security in the sovereignty of God. Because just as we may feel tossed to and fro by the powers of this world and disenfranchised in our status as exiles, the one whom we belong to is also the one who is in charge of all things, right? And so we have that security. But as we grapple with those realities, immediately the question comes to us, well, what is our response to these uncertain times? How do we take the realities that we learned about last week, and how do we respond appropriately to the truth that we live secure in the sovereignty of God? So the main point that comes out of the text that we go through today is going to be this: that we have God's confident hope in uncertain times when we resolve in ourselves that Jesus is Lord. This is where we go from hearing to responding, to receiving. And the key thing that happens in this passage is that Daniel, who is subjected to the powers of the world, who has the status of exile, and yet is in the sovereignty of God, chooses to respond to that situation by resolving himself to live according to the reality that he knows is most fundamental, that God is in control. You see, in this passage, we discover the power of resolve, the power of resolving ourselves in faith. As I was thinking about our passage and thinking of a fairly contemporary parallel, the memory of the great Olympic runner Eric Liddell came to mind. And I know that many of you know Eric Liddell, his story. It was made famous in the movie Chariots of Fire, and you at least know the music. But Eric Liddell is this man who, in the very beginning of the 20th century, had this exceptional gift for running. He ran just like no one had ever run. He was a super fast runner, and his country was super excited that we finally have a runner that is going to win at the Olympics, because he is the fastest in the world. And his event was the 100-meter dash. There was nobody that could compete with him. But Eric Liddell was also a son of missionaries. And he was very committed in his faith. And in fact, his dream was to be a missionary to China. And so he grew up with a resolve that Jesus is Lord. And part of his resolve that Jesus is Lord included his firm belief to truly observe Sunday as the Sabbath and not to work. And so when the 1924 Olympics come around, and he has been selected by his country to run the 100-meter race, and he has a guaranteed gold medal just showing up and running the races he is made by God to run. The schedule comes out that the 100-meter race was going to happen on a Sunday. And the story we all know, Eric Little said, I cannot run that race. I cannot run that race because I have made a prior commitment. I have resolved myself to my faith in the Lord, and I am going to observe the Sabbath. And to the shock of the world and to the scorn of his own country, he kept his commitment not to run and ended up signing up for the 400-meter race. And the beautiful thing is, even though the 400-meter race was not his race, he still won gold, right? But Eric Little is a story of the power of resolve. He resolved in himself that he was not going to fall into the cultural pressures of doing what the culture wanted him to do. He was going to stay committed to his belief that Jesus is Lord, and he was going to observe the Sabbath as he believed was right. This parallels the resolve that we see in the book of Daniel and of these main characters, principally Daniel himself. We see the power of resolve in Daniel, who determines that he is not going to go along with all of the program to make him a good Babylonian. And I love Wendy Witter's comment in her commentary. She reflects on the importance of Daniel's decision in chapter 1 of this very beginning of his story, in the very beginning of his exile, and the influence this plays in the rest of his life and the rest of his influence. Witter comments this. She says, the opening chapter of the book grounds Daniel and his friends' responses in all the circumstances to follow in the decision they made to be sustained by their God. You see, the reason that Daniel is a book of the Bible that is given to us for our instruction has to do with the fact that Daniel came to a choice. And he chose his faith over choosing the way of the world. And it is because he had that resolve that he stands for us as a reminder that there is certain hope in uncertain times for those who remain faithful. That is the purpose of this whole message today. I want to encourage us to be resolved in our faith, to be resolved in our belief that Jesus is Lord, to be resolved in that to the point that we choose God over the easy choice in the world. So this week, we are going to be looking at the why and the what and the how to be resolved during uncertain times, to be resolved in our faith during uncertain times. So I want to go through this. First of all, why we need to be resolved. Why do we need to be resolved? And so we're looking at this first handful of verses 3 through 7 in chapter 1. And as we look at these verses, we immediately see this extensive program of enculturating these young Israel exiles. And so we are seeing this issue of the power of cultural influence being pressed as hard as it can from nearly every direction upon these young exiles to become good Babylonians. And I want us to recognize in verses 3 through 7 that that there are two things about cultural influence that makes it so strong against us. The first is that cultural influence has the home court. I mean, home court advantage belongs to cultural influence, right? That is where everything is happening. We live on the culture's home court. And the home court that we see in Daniel takes on three particular approaches to taking advantage of the home court. First of all, the Babylonians seek to retrain these young men, to retrain them. Look at verse 4. Verse 4 says that we are going to take these youths without blemish and that we are going to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. And further it says that they would be trained intensively for 3 years before they would stand before the king. So the first thing that the home court of the culture does to these young men is it puts them in intensive training of the ways, the beliefs, the values, the religion of Babylon. And it instructs them for 3 years so that they would be so complete in the knowledge and understanding of the ways and beliefs of Babylon that they could be advisors and counselors to the king of Babylon. This is a desire to completely form their minds to think like Babylonians. The second thing that we see happens in the home court is these exiles are given new names. They come in as Daniel, and they come in as Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, but immediately they are given new names. And this is really a significant detail. We don't necessarily name people with a significant meaning today. More often we name people so that their name sounds good when it is said. But in the age of Daniel, names were given to communicate a deep truth, an identity-forming truth about that person. So for example, Daniel, you can see in the word Daniel the last two letters, E-L. Well, that is the Hebrew word for God. And so Daniel's name literally means God is my judge. God is my judge. But as he is taken off into exile, he's taken into Babylon, a place that is polytheistic, that believes in different gods, and their gods are named Bel and Marduk and Aku, and they have all these different gods. What happens to Daniel? His name goes from God is my judge to Belshazzar, which literally means Bel, the god Bel, protect his life. So he has gone from being one who is in his own name remembers his faith to having his name instead declare a false god. We look at Hananiah, which literally means Yahweh is gracious, is changed to the command of Aku. Mishael, which means who is like God, becomes changed to who is what Aku is. Azariah, which stands for Yahweh is my help, has his name changed to servant of Nebo. So can you understand what these renaming exercises are designed to do? Again and again and again, you are no longer referred to in the name of your God. You are referred to in the name of the Babylonian gods. You are being renamed as servants of those gods. And as you start hearing your name again and again repeated after these false gods, the idea is that you think of yourself in the image of those gods and forget yourself in the image of the God of Israel. The third thing, after the retraining and the renaming, is the resourcing. Look at verse 5. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. So in addition to the education, in addition to the renaming, they are also being given the best food, the best wine, the best life of the king. And they are being given all of this wonderful food. And boy, does food change what you think, right? I just got off of a cruise ship. I didn't want to leave that cruise ship because they had all the food I wanted, all the food I liked, all the drink you could imagine. It's like, why would I want to get off of this boat? I want to take this boat again and again and again. The king knows that if they get used to my food, they get used to my drink, they will be my people, no questions asked. And so we have this retraining, this renaming, this resourcing. As Wendy Witter says in her commentary, the king's strategy is to own them, mind and body. That is what is going on in this passage, is the king is seeking to own these young Israelite servants, mind and body. And we shouldn't think that really the world that we live in is any different. The world that we live in wants all of us to be good citizens of the world. And so just as Nebuchadnezzar focuses on retraining and naming and resourcing, we should recognize that those same forces, plus others, are at work in making us people of the world. It really boils down to this. Culture wants to remake us in its image. That's what it's existing to do, to propagate itself, to fashion you into the image of itself. Culture wants to remake us in its image, and it has the advantage of having home court. The second thing that we see about the power of cultural influence is that cultural influence has the head start. Not just home court, but head start. It is not accidental that Nebuchadnezzar said, I want you to find really good young people. I want young people to come and to be retrained and to be resourced and to be renamed. Because these young people have potentially greater opportunity of reforming than the older people. And so I want these young people, I want to start working all of these cultural pressures on them when they are young. Now, I would say in this respect, the situation and the story of Daniel and his friends is less bad in terms of the head start of culture than what we have when we are born into the United States or born into a culture. You see, they at least had 10, 15 years where they lived in the world of Israel and were if their parents were faithful, being taught the ways of God and being structured around the truth of Scripture. But that is not true when you are born in the world today. There are no Christian nations. And so what we have, for them, it started early. But for us, cultural influence starts at the very beginning. We are born into a culture that is not Christian. And that means that to live in this world puts us in a daily challenge of seeking to discern what in this culture is neutral and what in this culture is negative. Right? We are constantly just being pressed into the things that the culture values and the culture wants, and we are having to decide, is this thing neutral or is this thing going to be detrimental? And it is very difficult because we begin with the culture's home court and the culture's head start. So it is incredibly difficult to discern exactly where the culture is benign and where the culture is belligerent. Right? So what do we do? How do we deal with the challenges of a home court and a head start advantage to cultural influence? Well, thanks be to God. The whole New Testament is written in that world. And the New Testament won. So when Paul writes his letter to Rome, the most pagan and defiled city that you can imagine, the most hedonistic and self-centered and polytheistic world that you can imagine, he wrote to Romans who had become Christian with a simple formula for how to overcome the home court advantage and the head start advantage of culture when he says these words. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Here's what you have to recognize just a bit about that verse, is this idea of being conformed to the world. That's the default. If you're not doing anything, if you're not seeking to renew your mind, the default is you are conforming to the world. There is this kind of fulcrum that in Paul's mind, you are either conforming to the world or you are having your mind renewed in the will of God. And so if the mind is not being renewed, or if the mind is absent from God, it is by default being conformed to the will and ways and image of the world. There's no escape in the logic of this verse. One or the other is happening. There's no outside of this two-way street. And so for us, we have to recognize this is the why that we need to be resolved. The why that we need to be resolved boils down to this: we will be Babylonians until we resolve to be transformed by God's will. We will be Babylonians until we are resolved in ourselves to be transformed by God's will. So that's why we need to be resolved. Now let us look at the next point, what we must be resolved about. I mean, the big question as you look at the retraining and the renaming and the resourcing that is being flooded upon these young exiles, you ask this question as you're reading through the first 7 verses: what will happen to Daniel? Will he just become assimilated? Will he just become Babylonian? I mean, everything is working in that direction. And until we get to verse 8, it seems like Daniel and his friends are just going with the flow. I mean, they are in the school. They are learning divination. They are learning the names of all the gods. They are learning how to be agents of Babylon. And they're doing that apparently with no protest at all. And so it seems bleak until we come to verse 8. We read, "But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank." This is the key verse. This is the turning point for the book of Daniel. If you omit verse 8, the book of Daniel is a paragraph long. Nobody would have any reason to read the story of Daniel except he resolved. At this point, I will not defile myself. Now, the word resolved in the Hebrew literally translates the phrase set his heart. He set his heart, which is a way of saying he was convicted. He had conviction. In the wash of this culture, this stream, this river of cultural influence that is constantly pulling him into a false way, a false religion, a false image, he must hold to who he is with conviction. Otherwise, he will be swept away. What is he resolved about? What is he fundamentally resolved about? It's this: I am not a Babylonian. I am a son of Israel. That's the essence of what Daniel's conviction is about. I am not a Babylonian. I am a son of Israel. And that matters. That means I have to be different. I have to not go with everything that is happening around me. I am going to be in tension, being a son of Israel in the land of Babylon. He recognizes that the command, the call of God upon his life remains more ultimate than the command of the king Nebuchadnezzar, even when he is in Babylon, even when he is in Nebuchadnezzar's court. He recognizes the call of God, the life that God has called me to, is more ultimate, and my obedience to that one, that king, is more pressing than my obedience to this king. This is fundamental to a vital life of faith. It reminds me of a similar situation that happened to the first apostles after the resurrection of their Lord, as they are in Jerusalem preaching the good news of Jesus and declaring the truth that the one who they crucified has been risen and calls you to repentance, are brought in and severely warned by the rulers of Jerusalem to no longer speak in the name of Jesus. You see, Peter had a moment where he had to be resolved. Am I going to be a good Jerusalemite, a good Jew, or am I going to be a Christian? Am I going to be a son of God? And in this moment of intense conflict where he is being commanded, do not speak in the name of the Lord, let us read the passage in Acts chapter 5, verses 27 to 29. It says, when they had brought them, they set them before the council, and the high priest questioned them, saying, we strictly charged you not to teach in this name. Yet here you are filling Jerusalem with your teaching, and you intend to bring this man's blood upon us. But Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than men. That is the resolve. The same resolve in Daniel is the same resolve in Peter and the apostles. And then when Peter writes his letter at the end of his life to those who are going to carry the faith after he passes away, he says to them in 1 Peter 3:15, in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. You see, the Apostle Peter knows that the moment that he faced before the council is a moment that every Christian is going to face in this world. And the question is, have you set apart Christ as holy? Set apart Christ as holy so that the world will recognize that there is a hope. There is a program of operation in you that is distinguishable from the influence of culture. So distinguishable that people ask, what gives? Why are you like that? Why are you not like us in this way and that way? What makes you tick differently than everyone else? What's inside of you that guides you differently from me? That is what Peter is saying. There has to be resolve in our understanding that Jesus is Lord. This presses an important question. Are you Christian by conviction? Are you Christian by conviction? Have you set your heart on the truth that Christ is holy? Have you set your heart, have you fixed yourself like a nail being clenched that Jesus is Lord? Because we are coming into a time were those who merely have a said faith, who merely say, yeah, I believe in Jesus, but do not have it set in the heart, will get washed away in the storms of cultural temptation, cultural pressure, cultural persecution. They will find themselves on the sand, and the storm will take them away. Are you a Christian by conviction? A said faith will not resist assimilation. Only a heart convicted that Jesus is Lord will say, I cannot go there. That would defile me. You see, conviction sets a line. There is a lot of overlap between life as a Christian and life in this culture. Just as there was still a lot of space in Babylon for Daniel to live without protest, to live quietly, and to conduct his business. But there is still a place because he is a son of Israel, and there is still a place because we are sons and daughters of God, that there is a line where we cannot continue, where we have to say, I cannot go there. I will not do that. And it is a line of distinction. It is that line in us that causes the world, as Peter said it should, to ask us, what is this hope that has you going against the flow? What was Daniel's line? Daniel's line may appear a strange place. He doesn't draw the line at the education. He doesn't draw the line at the being renamed. He draws the line at eating the king's food and drinking the king's wine. Now, it may be that he had no option, he had no ability to resist those first two. But in truth, he had barely any option to reject the king's food and wine. And yet, he chose this place as the line of distinction. He said that if I eat and drink the king's food at this particular place in time, I would be defiling myself. Defiling is a strong word. What does he mean by defile? Well, commentators provide several different thoughts and options. First of all, it would be likely that because the Babylonian food doesn't follow all of the food laws given in the Old Testament, they would not be kosher, and so he can't eat non-kosher food. The problem with that is that there's no such thing as non-kosher wine. So maybe that's not really what's going on there. Other people say, well, it's because the king's food and the king's wine would have been used in idolatrous ceremonies to worship these false gods. Well, the problem with that explanation is so were the vegetables. Vegetables were used in these same idolatrous practices. So we can't really piece together a complete satisfying answer from simply saying this is an issue about being unclean food or this being idolatrous practiced food. It's possible that there are parts of that were in Daniel's mind, but it does not seem that those answers bear the weight of the text. What does Daniel mean when he talks about being defiled? I think Daniel is speaking to a deeper concern. He is speaking to the concern of identity. His sense that this food would defile him at the level of who he knows himself to be. It would defile his identity. You see, food and drink are our source of life, right? We are kept alive by our eating and our drinking. And so who you receive your food and drink from is who you are receiving your life from. And I think Daniel recognized, if I don't draw a line from the education and the naming and now my living from the king of Babylon, I will simply become the king's man. And so he requests, I want vegetables and I want water. Both of those are fundamentally unprocessed, natural foods. And it's not because there is something more healthy about unprocessed natural foods that is Daniel's concern. It is that those are the closest link to God the Creator, God the Provider. And so by refusing to eat the king's food and the king's wine and choosing to eat the stuff from the ground and the water, he is keeping himself connected to God as his provider, God as his sustainer, and recognizing in that act of not eating the king's food but relying on what God provides, that I am God's man. And that, I believe, is what is at issue with the food and the drink. You belong to the king who feeds you. And Daniel recognized, I need to know every time I eat and every time I drink, the king I serve is the King of Kings. Now, food and drink is just an example. We are not to take from the book of Daniel that we should have some sort of policy about food and drink. There can be overlaps. But the question is more, when Daniel looks at his world and sees an attack to his identity and sets a line driven by his conviction, it became an issue of food and drink to him. But that may not be the issue in our world. That may not be the issue in your life. The question that I want to place in front of you is, where are you at risk? Where are you at risk from losing the sense that I am God's man? I belong to Jesus versus I belong to America, or I belong to this tribe, or I belong to this subculture, or I belong to the Western world. What is the food and drink that can defile you? The food and drink that can defile you are the things that look good and are pleasing, and probably you can make sense in your mind that they are not objectionable. Hey, one good thing from exile. I get all the wine and all the meat I want. Finally, something good in this terrible, terrible situation. But it's exactly there that Daniel recognizes, this is where I am weak. This is where I probably will fail, because I'll receive my defilement happily and without resistance unless I do something resolving myself. What is the food and drink that can defile you? It is not just vices. It is not just getting drunk. It is not just drugs. It is not just pornography, although those can be issues that we are talking about. What Daniel is really responding to is the defilement that comes from bowing to cultural idols. Cultural idols. Now here's the thing. Idols generally are good things. Idols in and of themselves can be defended as, well, there's nothing wrong about this. There's nothing against God's word about this in and of itself. Where idols become so dangerous is idols take a good thing, something you see value in, something that you naturally desire, and make it an ultimate thing. Make it a thing that replaces your trust, your reliance, your awareness on God giving you your life, on God giving you your purpose, on God being the one who sustains you, provides for you. This is where idols become such terrible issues, because they take something good. So it is okay to enjoy good food, but when the food turns your belly into your God, then it's an idol. What are the cultural idols that may be at work defiling you from knowing whose you are and why you are here? Think about work. It is not hard to think that my food and my house and my security come from my hard work. I am given the life that is good because of my job. And therefore, I sacrifice for my job. I give everything that the job asks for and more. Maybe I neglect my kids and my wife, and I just keep working. Work is good. But when it is treated as the ultimate thing, as the giver of your identity, as the who am I? I'm an engineer. Versus, I'm a child of God. Then you're dealing with an idol. What about technology? Technology. Can't live in this world without technology. But some of us have gotten to the point that we can't live a day, maybe even 5 minutes, without looking at our phones to find out what's good, what's happening. Am I part of it? Am I not part of it? Living in fear of missing out keeps us glued to our phone to make sure that we know everything that's happening. And our thoughts are all conformed around it. After we went on this cruise, I decided, man, we've got to do a reset here. And so I made our family this weekend watch Wall-E. Wall-E is this great critique of American consumerism, and it really kind of focuses on the excesses of cruises. But there is this point where everybody just lives with a screen. Are you going on a cruise? All of their life is just a constant mirage of those little blinking lights and screens. And then a mistake happens and the screen breaks down. And this woman is like, wow, what a beautiful world we're flying through. Wow, I didn't know we had a pool. Like, the entire world was blocked because of their addiction to screens. And so technology, I hazard to tell you, I am more regular watching Facebook than I am picking up my Bible. That used to not be the case. I have a better discipline staying up on social media than I do reading the Word of God. And if the minutes between the two were compared, shame on me. Youth sports. What has happened? Let's let our kids have some experience to now we got to spend 6 weekends a year in Omaha. Why? Who wants Omaha that bad? But the point is that youth sports have by degree and degree and degree made your ability to say, I am going to commit to church harder and harder. And it is nearly impossible to fight your kid about a game on Sunday morning. But we are choosing youth sports more and more over faithful attendance to worship. You see, these are the kinds of cultural idols that we are degree by degree bowing to, and I could go on and on. Return to the story of Eric Liddell. Not only did he not take that race that he could have won, but the rest of the story is, after winning the gold, He was a national celebrity. He had a life in front of him of being the fastest man in the world and having all kinds of privileges and comforts of the world were heaped in front of him. But before he ever went to the Olympics, before he ever won the gold, he had already resolved himself. I'm going to be a missionary. And Eric Liddell left just years after winning the gold to be a missionary. And he died in China in a POW camp because he was resolved that I am God's man, not Britain's man, not the Olympics man. He left fame to be a missionary. Friends, how is your conviction that Jesus is Lord setting a line of distinction between yourself and our culture's idols? Where have you said, I cannot do that, it will defile me, it will pull me from my faith? Daniel argues that that is happening, and Peter argues that that is part of the life of living for God. So how will we keep our resolve? The chapter ends with answers to how we will keep our resolve. Now, there's always this tempting option to live life fully separated, right? To just separate ourselves from the world, to just exclude ourselves from culture and be like the Amish or be monastic. And I think Daniel is a subtle argument against that path, because Daniel shows us that when we are resolved in our faith, there is a third way. There is a third way where we can be in the world but not of the world. Listen to John Goldingay's commentary. He says, we are reassured that the Daniel who lives at court, stands by the side of the king, and serves the empire is one who has taken his stand and kept himself pure. We are called to be citizens of two worlds, neither surrendering one citizenship by assimilation, nor surrendering the other by forming a ghetto. And so how do we keep our resolve? The last few verses of chapter 1 give us two gifts that God provides. I'll deal with them briefly. The first gift that we have as we resolve ourselves that Jesus is Lord is we have God's providence. Providence is simply the truth that God provides and cares for his people through ordinary means. With Daniel's resolve to not defile himself in verse 8, we find God's providence accompanying him in verse 9. Look at verse 9. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. Alongside Daniel's commitment was God's commitment. I will chart a path for you to remain faithful. I will make people, well, we're not stopping. That's just the alarm that I should. We are on a path God provides to keep us faithful. Through unseen things, God was working to care for Daniel and to prosper him. So much so that verse 21 says that Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. He survived faithfully for 70 years in Babylonian exile. Why? Because of God's providence. Do you ever reflect on the little things? I mean, these things aren't extravagant, but they are the little things that work for your good. Reflect on Lamentations chapter 3, verse 22. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Lamentations is written by Jeremiah, who is living in the rubble of Jerusalem. There is nothing good happening in his life. There is nothing good happening in his world. And yet, Jeremiah is able to say, I see new mercies by God every day. There are new mercies every day. I shared one being that you woke up. I mean, God has something for you that he woke you up this morning. He has filled your eyes with something. But what Lamentations 3:22 tells us is the new mercies are there, and if you're not seeing them, It's that you're not looking and you're not receiving them. What are the new mercies God has given you this week? Look for them. The second gift is God's wisdom. Daniel's lying determines his actions, but then Daniel lives out his conviction. He figures out a way that he's not going to defile himself with this food. And so he has this conversation with the chief of eunuchs and says, can you please try a separate diet? And they have this dialogue and he says, give me just 10 days. 10 days to try this. 10 days is not enough time for any diet to work. Have you ever seen much change in 10 days? Trust me. I've tried them all. And 10 days is not going to change anything. But Daniel gets the response by asking for the 10 days that he needs to try it. This response allows God to show up. It is a faith-based test. And then we have in verse 15, I love verse 15. At the end of 10 days, after eating just vegetables and waters, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. Everybody who recommends the Daniel diet never reads verse 15 because it promises you are going to be fatter in 10 days. Vegetables have never done that to me. This is clearly God. God has made these fatty vegetables. But it is short enough and the effects are dramatic enough that Daniel is allowed to keep himself from being defiled. I love how Sidney Greidanus responds to this. He says, they will always know from this that their good physical appearance is not due to the rich Babylonian food, but due to the blessing of their God. And where is Daniel's wisdom from? It's right there in verse 17. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Who gave them this wisdom? It is God. God gives us wisdom to know the right thing, the right way, the right time to remain faithful. James 1:5 says this. I think it's the next slide. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. Where are you needing wisdom to navigate your faith in uncertain times? God says, ask me. So why do we need to be resolved? What must we do to be resolved? How will we keep our resolve? We've seen all 3 of these in the book of Daniel. Those who truly believe in Jesus as Lord are those who will endure uncertain times. I want to finish with Jesus' words to encourage all of us in Matthew 7:24. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell. And great was the fall of it. The most urgent question, it all boils down to this. Are you convicted that Jesus is your Lord? Have you built your life on the rock? Give your life to him, and you will not be carried away by the storm. Amen?